The airplane was quiet as it cruised high above the clouds, its engines humming steadily. In first class, a well-dressed man sat calmly, his eyes scanning through a business report on his tablet. He was a black billionaire, known for his incredible rise to wealth and success. His name was Elijah, and he was the kind of man who didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened. He wasn't a man who liked attention, but his presence always commanded respect. Elijah had worked hard to get where he was. He came from nothing, and now he was one of the most influential men in the world. His businesses stretched across continents, and his sharp mind and cool demeanor had made him a household name in the corporate world. But no matter how successful he had become, Elijah never forgot the importance of staying grounded, of treating people well, regardless of their status. As he sat back in his plush seat, his mind wandered over the upcoming meeting he would have once he landed. He had no idea that this flight would soon change his day in a way he never expected. At the front of the cabin, the flight attendants moved quickly through the aisles, making sure everything was running smoothly. Among them was Sarah, a young woman in her mid-20s. She had been a flight attendant for a few years now, but today she was feeling the weight of a long and exhausting shift. Sarah had always been the kind of person who prided herself on being efficient. She liked things done quickly, without fuss. But there was something about today that made her on edge. Maybe it was the long hours or the stressful demands from her superiors, but whatever it was, it had caused her patience to thin. She moved swiftly through the cabin, serving drinks and snacks, her eyes moving past the passengers with the sort of practiced indifference only someone in her position could manage. As Sarah passed by Elijah's seat, she noticed him, but didn't give him much more than a passing glance. She had a job to do, and the rich businessman sitting in first class wasn't her concern. But then something small happened, a slight misunderstanding, perhaps a little miscommunication. Elijah had politely asked for more water, and without looking up, Sarah responded sharply, a little annoyed by the constant stream of requests from other passengers. She didn't mean anything by it, but the tone in her voice carried a subtle edge. Elijah, however, remained composed. He didn't flinch or show any emotion. He simply nodded, acknowledging her response, and leaned back in his seat. Sarah, caught in her own stress, didn't notice the glint in his eye, something that suggested there was more to Elijah than the average businessman. To her, he was just another wealthy man on a flight, one of many she had encountered over the years. But then, something unexpected happened. As Sarah walked back toward the galley, she turned and, without warning, slapped Elijah across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the quiet cabin, and a collective gasp came from the passengers nearby. Everyone froze, unsure of what to do. Sarah's face went pale as she realized what she had just done. She had slapped a billionaire, someone who could easily ruin her career with a single phone call. Elijah didn't react immediately. He didn't raise his voice, didn't shout. He simply stared ahead, his face still and calm. Sarah's heart raced as she stood there, frozen in disbelief. She had never made such a mistake before. The flight attendants and passengers around her were in shock, watching as she fumbled for an apology. But Elijah said nothing. His eyes remained fixed, and for a brief moment, it seemed like nothing would happen. The air was thick with tension, but Elijah didn't move, didn't speak. He merely looked out of the window as if the slap had never happened. The silence was deafening. Sarah's hands trembled, unsure of what to do next. She had crossed a line, but would there be consequences? The moment stretched on, making everyone uncomfortable, yet Elijah still said nothing. He sat there with a sense of calm, almost as if he were waiting for something. Sarah, now fully aware of what she had just done, tried to apologize again, but the words came out in a rushed jumble, unsure and panicked. But Elijah wasn't fazed. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable. The moment of tension passed, and the rest of the flight continued in an uneasy silence. What Sarah didn't realize was that Elijah's silence wasn't because he was too shocked to respond. It was because he was already planning his next move. Little did Sarah know, the events of the next few minutes would change everything for her, and the billionaire sitting quietly in first class would not let this slip go unnoticed. The flight continued smoothly, but the tension in the air was palpable. Elijah remained silent, his eyes fixed out the window, as if the incident had never happened. To the people around him, it seemed like he was merely lost in thought, perhaps reviewing business details in his mind. But inside, he was far from calm. Elijah's mind was sharp, and he never forgot a slight, no matter how small. The slap had been more than just a personal insult. It was a challenge to his dignity, and he knew that things like this had consequences. Sarah, on the other hand, was a bundle of nerves. She walked back and forth down the aisle, trying to keep her composure, but her mind was racing. She had slapped a billionaire, a man who had the power to destroy her career with a single phone call. The more she thought about it, the worse the situation seemed. Every time she looked over at Elijah, she felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. His silence was the worst part. If he was angry, if he was yelling, she could understand it. But his calmness made it all the more terrifying. She kept trying to apologize, but Elijah just nodded and said nothing. There was something unnerving about his complete lack of reaction. It was as if he was waiting for something. Sarah didn't know it, but that something was already happening. Elijah had dealt with all kinds of people in his life. He'd faced critics, rivals, and enemies who had underestimated him, but none of them had dared to cross him the way Sarah had. He wasn't the type to react impulsively, but he knew that people who wronged him needed to understand that there were always consequences. He had built his empire with careful planning and patience, and he applied the same approach to his personal dealings. In his world, every move was calculated, every action had a purpose, and there was always a price to pay for disrespect. As the hours passed, Sarah's anxiety grew. She watched the passengers around her, wondering if they had noticed what had happened. Had they heard the slap? Did they realize who she had just slapped? She felt the eyes of her colleagues on her, and each glance made her feel more exposed. Everyone was aware of the incident, but no one dared to say anything. The atmosphere on the plane had shifted. The other flight attendants, who had been busy with their duties, now whispered among themselves. Some were nervous about how the situation would end, while others just watched in silent curiosity. Sarah tried to focus on her job, but it was hard. The weight of what had happened was always in the back of her mind. She glanced over at Elijah again, but he was still calm, still quiet. He hadn't made any move to escalate things, and yet Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that he was planning something. It was a feeling she couldn't ignore, one that made her skin crawl. What she didn't know was that Elijah had already made a decision. He wasn't one to be reckless, and he wasn't one to lash out in anger. But he had resources, he had connections, and he knew how to make people pay when they crossed him. The wheels were already in motion, even though Sarah had no idea. As the flight neared its destination, Sarah tried to distract herself with routine tasks, but she couldn't stop thinking about what might happen next. She had no way of knowing that her careless mistake would soon send her life into a tailspin. The rest of the passengers began to prepare for landing, but the unease in the air remained. It was as though everyone on the plane could sense that something was about to happen. Elijah, however, was calm as ever. His thoughts were clear, and his mind was focused on one thing: making sure that the price for what had happened would be paid. When the plane finally touched down, Sarah was tense, her hands shaking as she went through the final steps of disembarking the passengers. She had no idea how the billionaire would choose to take his revenge, but she had a sinking feeling in her gut. She could feel the change in the air, the shift in power. Elijah hadn't reacted in the moment, but she knew something was coming, and it wasn't going to be pretty. She just didn't know yet that her life would never be the same after today. As the passengers filed off the plane, Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation hanging over her. Her palms were sweaty, and she kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting Elijah to say something, to confront her. But he didn't. He was the last person to get off the plane, his calm demeanor never wavering. There was no sign of anger, no trace of the fury she had imagined might come. And yet, Sarah felt more nervous than ever. His silence was far more unsettling than any outburst could have been. The moment the doors of the plane closed behind him, Elijah's business partner, Andrew, was waiting for him at the airport terminal. Andrew was a trusted ally, someone who had been by Elijah's side since the early days of his empire. Elijah gave him a brief nod, and without saying much, the two of them made their way to the car that would take them to their next destination. Elijah was deep in thought, his mind already moving forward, planning his next steps. Meanwhile, Sarah was still trying to shake off the anxiety that gripped her. She had hoped, in some small corner of her mind, that the incident would be forgotten. That maybe, after a few hours, things would go back to normal. But as she changed out of her uniform and prepared to head home, she realized that this wasn't something that could just be brushed aside. The slap she had given Elijah wasn't just a mistake. It was a challenge. That night, as Sarah tried to sleep, her mind kept racing. What would happen to her? Would she lose her job? She couldn't stop imagining Elijah's powerful connections, wondering who he could reach out to, who could destroy her career with a single call. Every scenario played out in her head, each one darker than the last. She kept telling herself she would apologize properly the next time she saw him. But deep down, she knew that would never be enough. She had crossed a line, and no amount of pleading could take that back. Elijah, on the other hand, wasn't losing sleep over the incident. In fact, he wasn't thinking about Sarah at all, not in the way she imagined. He had dealt with worse insults from people much more powerful than her, and he knew exactly how to handle situations like this. For him, revenge wasn't about making a scene. It wasn't about anger. It was about control, about teaching a lesson that no one would forget. And with his resources, he had plenty of ways to make sure Sarah learned hers. The next day, Sarah arrived at work, trying to keep a low profile. She was hoping that maybe, just maybe, the day would go by without incident. But when she entered the staff room, she was met with a chilling silence. The other flight attendants didn't say anything, but the looks they gave her were enough. She could feel their judgment, their unease. Everyone had heard what had happened, and everyone knew that this wasn't just any passenger she had crossed. This was Elijah, a man whose reputation was as vast as it was intimidating. As Sarah gathered her things for her next shift, a supervisor came up to her, his face serious. He didn't say anything at first, but simply handed her a note. Sarah took it, her heart pounding in her chest. As she unfolded the paper, her stomach dropped. It was an internal memo, informing her that she had been placed on temporary suspension pending an investigation. She was to report to HR as soon as possible. The world around her seemed to close in as she read the words. Everything she had worked for, everything she had built in her career, felt like it was slipping through her fingers. The slap, the mistake she had made, was now threatening to ruin everything. She could feel her knees weaken, and for a moment, she wondered if she would even have a job by the end of the day. What Sarah didn't know, however, was that this was only the beginning. Elijah's influence reached far beyond just the airline industry, and his reach extended to powerful people who had the ability to make decisions that would change lives. And while Sarah was busy worrying about her job, Elijah was already working in the background, using every connection at his disposal to make sure she understood the consequences of her actions. As the days went on, Sarah's situation only grew more complicated. Rumors swirled through the office, and whispers followed her wherever she went. She was now a figure of curiosity, a symbol of what happens when someone challenges the wrong person. But no one knew the full story, not yet. Elijah had carefully orchestrated everything, and Sarah had no idea just how ruthless the man she had slapped really was. Sarah sat at her desk, her hands trembling as she looked at the suspension notice again. The words blurred together as she tried to process what was happening. Her mind raced, wondering how Elijah had managed to pull the strings so quickly. One moment, she had slapped a man she thought was just another rich businessman. Now she was in the middle of a storm, with her career hanging by a thread. The next few days felt like a blur. Sarah had been called into HR for what she thought would be a simple discussion, but it quickly became clear that this was more than just a warning. The room was cold, and the air felt thick with tension as she sat across from her supervisor and a HR representative. They didn't speak much at first, but the silence was deafening. Sarah could feel her heart pounding in her chest. Finally, the HR representative spoke. "We've received a number of complaints about your behavior," they said in a calm but firm voice. "You've slapped a passenger, someone with connections to powerful people. This isn't just about a mistake on the job, Sarah. This is a serious matter." The words hit her like a slap across the face. She had known there would be consequences, but hearing them laid out like this made everything feel real. The sinking feeling in her stomach only deepened. Sarah tried to explain herself, to apologize, but the words felt weak in her mouth. She had never been in a situation like this before, and no amount of excuses could change what she had done. The HR representative looked at her with pity, but it didn't matter. The damage was already done. After what felt like hours, they finally told her she would be placed on indefinite leave while they conducted an internal investigation. Elijah, meanwhile, wasn't thinking about Sarah directly. He had already moved on to the next phase of his plan. His empire was built on control, and he wasn't the kind of person to let someone disrespect him without ensuring that person learned their lesson. He wasn't interested in making a scene. Instead, he quietly reached out to a few key figures, lawyers, business associates, and others who owed him favors. He didn't need to make a phone call to destroy someone's career. He had more subtle ways of dealing with people who crossed him. Elijah's plan began to unfold slowly. By the time Sarah received her suspension notice, Elijah had already made arrangements. His connections in the airline industry ensured that her name was now known in certain circles, her reputation tarnished before she could even explain herself. Her suspension was just the beginning. Elijah had made sure that no airline would hire her, that no job would be available to her in the industry she had worked so hard to be a part of. As the days dragged on, Sarah grew more desperate. Her savings were quickly dwindling, and the thought of finding another job felt impossible. The whispers continued, and every time she left the house, she felt like everyone was looking at her, judging her. It wasn't just her career at risk anymore, it was her future. She had no idea how she could fix this. One night, as she sat alone in her apartment, the weight of the situation finally hit her. She had been too proud, too quick to judge Elijah. Now she was paying the price. There was no way out, no way to undo the damage. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. She looked at the screen, and her heart skipped a beat when she saw the name. It was her old colleague, and the message was simple. "It's worse than you think." Before Sarah could even process the message, her phone buzzed again, this time with an email from the airline. It was a formal letter confirming her termination. It wasn't just a suspension anymore. She was out of a job for good. The tears she had been holding back finally broke free as she sat there, unable to move. Her entire world felt like it was crumbling around her. She had crossed the wrong person, and now it seemed like there was no way to escape the consequences. She had no idea that this was just the beginning of her downfall. Elijah wasn't done yet, and he had more planned for her than she could ever imagine. But for now, all Sarah could do was sit there, her heart heavy with the realization that her life had been completely altered by one careless mistake. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah's world seemed to fall apart piece by piece. The moment she thought things couldn't get any worse, they did. Each day, she woke up to the same feeling of dread, knowing that Elijah's revenge was still at work. She hadn't heard from him since that fateful day on the plane, but his influence was everywhere. The phone calls never came, and the emails from recruiters were as sparse as the job offers. She tried to move on, to focus on something, anything, but it felt impossible. Every time she opened her inbox, her heart sank. There were no job offers, no interviews, just more rejection. She felt trapped in her own failure, surrounded by a wall she couldn't break down. It wasn't just the job loss anymore. It was the feeling of being erased. Her name was becoming a whisper in the industry, a symbol of someone who had crossed the line with the wrong person. One afternoon, Sarah received an unexpected call. The number was unfamiliar, and her first instinct was to ignore it, but something told her she should answer. She picked up the phone, her hands still shaking. "Hello. Is this Sarah Daniels?" The voice on the other end was calm, neutral. She could hear the faint sound of a busy office in the background. "Yes, this is Sarah," she replied, her voice cracking slightly. "I'm calling from the law firm of Collins and Pierce," the voice continued. "We've been hired to handle your case. There are some important matters we need to discuss regarding your current situation." Sarah's mind raced. A law firm. What could this possibly be about? Was Elijah involved? Had he pushed things even further than she could have imagined? She barely had time to process the information before the call ended. The man on the other line had given her an address and asked her to come in the next day for a meeting. She had no idea what this was about, but the fact that a law firm was involved only made her more nervous. Was this the next stage of Elijah's revenge? Had he really gone this far? The next day, Sarah made her way to the firm's office. It was an upscale building, the kind of place where important decisions were made. She was greeted by a receptionist who led her into a sleek conference room. The room was filled with the faint scent of polished wood and leather chairs. A man in a sharp suit stood up as she entered, his posture impeccable. "Ms. Daniels, thank you for coming," he said smoothly, offering a handshake. His face was calm, his expression unreadable. "Please, have a seat." He gestured to the chair across from him. Sarah sat down, her mind racing with questions. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was all connected to Elijah, and that he was about to make the final move. The man opposite her opened a folder on the table and slid a piece of paper in front of her. "This is a non-disclosure agreement," he explained. "We're here to offer you an opportunity to resolve this situation." Sarah looked at the paper, but the words blurred in her vision. She had no idea what kind of opportunity could possibly resolve her mess, but she had no choice but to listen. "The man you encountered on the flight, Mr. Elijah Rivers, has requested that we represent you in a delicate matter," the lawyer continued. "He has made it clear that if you cooperate fully with his terms, he's willing to offer you a way out of this situation." Sarah's heart pounded. Elijah. The name sent chills through her. She didn't know what kind of power he wielded, but it was clear he had the ability to control everything now. The lawyer's eyes met hers, and for a moment, she saw something unreadable in his gaze. "This could be your last chance, Ms. Daniels. You have to decide if you're willing to accept the terms. If you refuse, the consequences will be irreversible." The pressure in the room seemed to increase, the air thick with tension. Sarah had no idea what Elijah wanted or what his terms would be, but she knew she couldn't afford to refuse. Her career, her reputation, everything she had worked for, was on the line. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. This wasn't just about one mistake anymore. It was about survival. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do whatever it takes." The lawyer nodded, a slight smile appearing on his face. "Very well. We'll begin immediately." The next few days felt like they were moving in slow motion. Sarah could barely focus on anything else as her mind kept replaying the conversation with the lawyer. Elijah had made it clear that his influence was far-reaching, and it was becoming painfully obvious that he wasn't someone to cross. But as much as she hated feeling like a pawn in his game, she knew that her only chance of escaping this mess was to play along. She had no other options left. The law firm had given her a strict set of instructions. First, she was to keep her distance from her colleagues and anyone involved with the airline. She wasn't allowed to contact anyone from her past life. That was the price she had to pay for her mistake. They told her to remain silent, to stop looking for work, and to wait. The waiting was the hardest part. Every time her phone buzzed, Her heart would race, wondering if it was Elijah or his lawyers reaching out to her again. During this time, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her apartment felt smaller, the walls closing in as she stayed indoors, only leaving when absolutely necessary. It wasn't paranoia. She could sense the change in the way people treated her. When she did venture out for groceries or a simple errand, the whispers followed her. The moment she walked into a store or a coffee shop, heads would turn. People were talking about her, but no one would ever say it directly to her face. She had become a subject of gossip, a cautionary tale about the consequences of crossing someone with too much power. On the outside, Sarah tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but inside, she was breaking. The longer she waited, the more uncertain she became. What were Elijah's terms? What exactly did he want from her? Was there any way for her to truly escape this nightmare, or was she stuck in a web of his making? Finally, a week later, she received another call from the law firm. This time, it was more urgent. The voice on the other end was quick and direct. "We need you to come in tomorrow," the lawyer said. "Elijah has made his decision, and we need to prepare you for what comes next." The call ended abruptly, and Sarah was left in a daze. What did that even mean? Elijah had made his decision. She felt a mix of fear and confusion. Her stomach twisted with anxiety as she packed her things for the meeting. There was no turning back now. She had no idea what Elijah wanted from her, but one thing was clear. She was no longer in control of her own fate. The next morning, Sarah made her way to the law firm's office, her heart racing with every step. As she entered the building, she was led into a sleek, modern conference room. This time, there was no lawyer sitting across from her. Instead, Elijah himself was standing by the window, looking out over the city skyline. His presence was commanding, and Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as he turned to face her. Elijah looked exactly as he had on the plane, calm, collected, and intimidating. His sharp eyes seemed to take in everything about her in that one moment, assessing her as if she were a puzzle to be solved. His gaze lingered, and for a moment, Sarah felt small, like she was being judged. He walked toward her slowly, each step echoing in the quiet room. His voice was smooth, almost too smooth when he finally spoke. "Sarah," he said, his tone neither friendly nor threatening. "You've made quite an impression on me, and I'm not someone who forgets easily." Sarah's throat went dry. She had no idea how to respond. She wanted to apologize again, to explain, but she knew that would do nothing. Elijah wasn't the type of person who accepted apologies. He didn't need them. What he wanted was control, and he wasn't about to let her off easy. "I've thought long and hard about what should happen next," he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "And I've decided that you owe me. You owe me for what you did, and for every inconvenience I've had to endure because of your actions." Sarah's pulse quickened as she listened, her mind racing. What did he mean by "you owe me"? What kind of debt was she being forced to pay? Elijah stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "You're going to work for me, Sarah, and when I'm done, you'll understand the true cost of crossing me." Every muscle in Sarah's body tensed. The words were simple, but the weight of them was suffocating. She couldn't breathe. Elijah was giving her no choice. She had to comply. There was no way out. Sarah spent the next few days in a haze, her mind racing as she tried to process everything that had happened. Elijah's words kept echoing in her head, replaying over and over. "You owe me." What did he mean by that? And what was he going to make her do? The uncertainty was unbearable. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking deeper into a trap, and there was no way out. The law firm had given her clear instructions. She was to meet with Elijah again, this time at his private office. She was told to dress professionally, to look the part of someone who was willing to work for him, though she felt anything but professional. As she prepared for the meeting, her heart raced. What would he ask of her next? What kind of job could he possibly offer her in exchange for her debt? The office was as cold and sterile as the last time she had visited. The walls were lined with dark wood, and large windows overlooked the city below. The faint sound of traffic was the only thing breaking the silence. Elijah was already there, standing by his desk, his back to her. When he heard her footsteps, he turned around slowly, as though he had been waiting for her arrival all along. "Sarah," he greeted her, his voice calm, almost casual. "I've been thinking. You're going to need to prove yourself if you want to pay off your debt. And I'm not a man who takes chances, so we'll start with something small." Sarah's stomach tightened at his words. A small part of her had hoped that he would let her off easy, but that was a foolish thought. Elijah wasn't the type to be merciful. He wanted something from her, and she had no choice but to give it. He motioned to the chair across from him. "Sit. Let's talk about your first task." She sat down, her palms sweaty. Elijah leaned against his desk, looking at her with cold eyes. He didn't need to say anything more for Sarah to understand that this was just the beginning. He would push her, test her, and make her pay for crossing him in ways she couldn't even imagine. "I'm going to need you to work closely with a few of my associates," he said, his tone turning businesslike. "You'll be representing my interests in some high-stakes meetings. These are people who can help me expand my influence, and I need someone who can handle themselves under pressure." Sarah nodded slowly, trying to steady her nerves. She knew this wasn't just about business. Elijah was testing her loyalty, seeing if she could be trusted to do what he asked without hesitation. He was giving her an opportunity, but it came with a price. "I'll make sure you're well prepared for these meetings," Elijah continued, his gaze sharp. "But understand this. Failure is not an option. If you disappoint me, if you fail to deliver, there will be consequences. I don't tolerate mistakes." She didn't respond right away. There was no point in arguing. She knew that no matter what she said, it wouldn't change anything. Elijah had all the power, and she was just a pawn in his game. The only thing she could do now was survive. Over the next few weeks, Sarah was thrust into Elijah's world. She had no choice but to keep moving forward, pretending that everything was fine while she worked alongside his associates. She attended meetings, made deals, and navigated a world that felt increasingly foreign to her. But with every passing day, she felt more and more like a puppet on a string, unable to break free. Despite the pressure, she started to notice something. Elijah was watching her closely, but not in the way she had feared. At first, she thought he was waiting for her to make a mistake. But now, it seemed like he was testing her, seeing how far she would go before breaking. And as much as she hated it, Sarah realized that she was starting to understand the game. Elijah wasn't just punishing her. He was teaching her how to survive in his world, how to control the people around her, how to bend others to her will. One night, after a particularly intense meeting, Elijah pulled her aside. "You're doing well, Sarah," he said, his tone surprisingly approving. "But don't get too comfortable. There's still a long way to go." She nodded, unsure of what to say. His praise felt hollow, but she didn't dare argue. As much as she hated being trapped in this situation, a small part of her began to realize that she was changing. Elijah had shown her how to play the game, and now there was no going back.